The spinal cord provides a vital link between the brain and the rest of the body, where the spinal cord and its attached nerves serve as a pathway for sensory and motor impulses, as well as they are responsible for reflexes, which are our quickest reactions to a stimulus. The adult spinal cord typically ranges between 42 and 45 centimeters, which is about 16 to 18 inches in length, and extends inferiorly from the brain through the magnum foramen, and then travels through the length of the vertebral canal and ends at the level of either L1 or L2, where the tapering inferior end of the spinal cord, this is termed the conus medullaris. The conus medullaris marks the official end of the spinal cord proper, which again is usually around lumbar vertebrae 1 or 2, and inferior to this point, groups of the axons, collectively called the cauda equina, project inferiorly from the spinal cord. And it's called the cauda equina because it resembles a horse's tail, and this is where we find a majority of the lumbar and sacral nerves. Now the conus medullaris, which marks the end of the spinal cord, is typically where a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap is done, as well as with an epidural. The regions of the spinal cord include the cervical part, which is the superior-most region of the spinal cord and is continuous with the medulla oblongata. This is where we find motor neurons that axons contribute to the cervical spinal nerves and receive input from sensory neurons through the spinal nerves. Within the inferior cervical part of the spinal cord, we find the cervical enlargement, and this contains the neurons that innervate the upper limbs. The thoracic part lies inferior to the cervical part, and it contains the neurons for the thoracic spinal nerves. The lumbar part is the shortest segment of the spinal cord, and it contains the neurons for the lumbar spinal nerves. We have a lumbar enlargement that extends through the lumbar and sacral parts of the spinal cord, and so these innervate the lower limbs. The sacral part lies inferior to the lumbar part and contains the neurons for the sacral spinal nerves. And the coccygeal part is the most inferior tip of the spinal cord, where there's only one pair of coccygeal spinal nerves that come from this region. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves within the spinal cord that connect the central nervous system to the muscles, to receptors, and glands throughout the body. The spinal nerves are considered to be mixed nerves because they contain both motor and sensory axons. And so spinal nerves are identified by the part of the spinal cord in which they reside from. So thus the spinal cord that contains 8 cervical nerves are termed C1 to C8. We have 12 thoracic nerves, T1 through T12, 5 lumbar nerves, T1 through T5, 5 sacral nerves, S1 to S5, and 1 coccygeal nerve, which is CO1. The spinal meninges are continuous with the cranial meninges, and the outermost layer, most superficial, is the dura mater, just like with the cranial meninges, and this helps to provide stability for the spinal cord. The dura mater extends between the adjacent vertebrae and it fuses with the connective tissue layers that surround the spinal nerves. Deep to that is the arachnoid mater, and then deepest is the pia mater, which is a delicate and meningeal layer that is composed of elastic and collagen fibers. The spinal cord has 2 different areas. We have an inner gray matter region and the outer white matter region. The gray matter is dominated by the dendrites and the cell bodies of neurons and glial cells and unmyelinated axon, where the white matter is composed primarily of myelinated axons. The gray matter of the spinal cord is centrally located and it has this H or butterfly shape. We have the anterior horn, which is the left and the right anterior masses of the gray matter. And the anterior horns primarily house the cell bodies of somatic motor neurons that innervate skeletal muscles. The posterior horns, or dorsal horns, are the left and right posterior masses of gray matter, and the axons of sensory neurons and the cell bodies of interneurons are found in these horns. The gray commissure is a horizontal bar of gray matter that surrounds the narrow central canal, and the gray commissure is primarily consistent of unmyelinated axons and serve as a communication between the right and left sides of the gray matter. Within the central canal, this is where we have the cerebral spinal fluid that circulates. For the formation of the spinal nerves from the spinal cord, what we have are the posterior or dorsal roots, and these are sensory axons only, where the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are located in the dorsal root ganglion, or the posterior root ganglion, which is attached to the posterior root. The anterior side, we have the anterior or ventral root, which contains the motor axons only, and the motor axons arise from cell bodies in the anterior and lateral horns of the spinal cord. The spinal nerves, we have 31 of them, and they connect, again, the central nervous system to muscles, glands, and receptors. And so a spinal nerve contains both sensory axons from the posterior roots and motor axons from the anterior roots. And so we find a spinal nerve within an intervertebral foramen that is superior or inferior to the vertebrae of the same number. So, for example, the second cervical spinal nerve exits the vertebral canal through the intervertebral foramen between C1 and C2 vertebrae. The organization of the peripheral nervous system allows two different pathways that are integrated within the spinal cord. And so the central nervous system communicates with the peripheral body structures through the different pathways. And these pathways can either conduct sensory or motor information where processing and integration occurs continuously alongside them. These pathways travel through the white matter of the brainstem and spinal cord as they connect various regions of the central nervous system with the spinal nerves. The nervous system pathways are either sensory or motor again, and so sensory are called ascending pathways, and this is where, again, sensory information is gathered by sensory receptors that ascend up from the spinal cord to the brain. And so sensory pathways conduct information about limb position and the sensations of touch, temperature, pressure, and pain that sent that information to the brain. And so also there is fine integration between touch, such as texture and the shape of unseen objects, and this includes pressure, touch, and vibration perception. Also, we have temperature and pain that allows us to detect the sensation, as well as a sensation of itching, and then proprioception that allows us to detect the position of joints, stretch in muscles, and tension in tendons. And so that information then is traveled to the nervous system, and again on the dorsal side of the spinal cord, and then information is integrated within that spinal cord where it's sent up to the brainstem, or it can be conducted there, and the impulse is then sent on to the ventral side, where now we have the motor pathways. And so the motor pathways are also called descending pathways, because this is where now information is taken from the brain through the spinal cord and then essentially to muscles. And so we have cell bodies within the motor neurons and interneurons that are involved in innervation and controlling of limbs and the trunk muscle that are found in the anterior horn and the gray matter between the anterior horn and posterior horn. The motor neurons that we find also are responsible for both conscious and unconscious control of skeletal muscle activity. The spinal cord has 31 pairs of spinal nerves that connect the central nervous system to muscles, receptors, and glands. The spinal nerves are considered to be both mixed nerves because they contain both motor axons, and sensory axons. They are identified by the first letter of the spinal cord part to which they attach combined with a number. So thus we have 8 cervical nerves called C1 through C8 on each side of the spinal cord, 12 thoracic nerves called T1 through T12, which again are on both sides of the spinal cord, 5 lumbar nerves called L1 to L5, 5 sacral nerves called S1 to S5, and 1 coccygeal nerve called CO1. The cervical spinal nerves innervate the head, neck, diaphragm, and arms, and these are considered to be part of the peripheral nervous system. And within the cervical spinal nerves, we find the cervical enlargement, which is found in the inferior cervical part of the spinal cord, and this contains neurons that innervate the upper limbs. The thoracic spinal nerves have the nerves that are associated and innervate the chest and abdominal muscles. The lumbar spinal nerves are found to be associated with leg muscles. And furthermore, we find the lumbar or lumbar sacral enlargement that extends through the lumbar and the sacral parts of the spinal cord and innervates the lower limbs. We have the sacral spinal cord, which is important for functioning of the bowel, bladder, sexual function, and for feet. And then lastly, we have the coccygeal region, where this is important for the anus.
A nerve plexus is a network of interleaving anterior rami of the spinal nerves, and so they're only found on the anterior portion of the spinal cord. And they form on both the right and left sides of the body, and then they're split into named areas. And so we have nerve plexuses in the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral regions only. The cervical plexus is found deep on each side of the neck and immediately lateral to the cervical vertebrae of C1 through C4. And so these are formed by the anterior side of the spinal nerves of C1 to C4. These innervate the anterior neck muscles as well as the skin of the neck and portions of the head and shoulder. One important nerve that we find from this is the phrenic nerve, which is formed primarily from C4 nerve and some contributions of axons from C3 and C5. The phrenic nerve travels through the thoracic cavity to innervate the diaphragm.
And so here we have an image of the cervical plexus, and again, the anterior and the posterior roots come together to form the spinal nerves, which is found within the intervertebral foramen of the vertebrae, and that is superior or inferior to the vertebrae of the same number. So for example, the second cervical spinal nerve exits the vertebral canal through the intervertebral foramen between the C1 and the C2 vertebrae. The eighth cervical spinal nerve is the only exception. It leaves the intervertebral foramen between C7 and T1 vertebrae, and so the spinal nerves inferior to C8 exit below the vertebrae of the same number.
The brachial plexus is again formed on the right and left side, and these supply the upper limbs. The spinal nerves involved are C5 through T1, and they extend laterally from the neck and pass superiorly to the first rib and then continue into the axillary region. Each brachial plexus innervates the pectoral girdle and the entire upper limb of one side. And these are further divided into 3 different regions. We have the superior trunk, and this is formed from nerves C5 and C6, the middle trunk, which is formed from nerve C7, and the inferior trunk, which is formed from nerve C8 and T1.
Upon reaching the axilla, the anterior and posterior divisions converge to form 3 cords. The posterior cord is posterior to the axillary artery and is formed by the posterior division of the superior, middle, and inferior trunks. Therefore, it contains portions of C5 through T1 nerves. The medial cord is medial to the axillary artery and is formed by the anterior division of the inferior trunk. It contains portions of nerves C8 through T1. And finally, the lateral cord is lateral to the axillary artery and is formed from the anterior division of the superior and middle trunks. And it contains portions of nerves C5 through C7. Finally, from the three cords of the posterior, medial, and lateral cords, there emerges 5 major terminal branches. The first, the axillary nerve, travels through the axilla and posterior to the surgical neck of the humerus. It emerges from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus and innervates both the deltoid and the teres minor muscles. Next, we have the median nerve, and this is formed from branches of the medial and lateral cords to the brachial plexus. This nerve travels along the midline of the arm and forearm and deep to the carpal tunnel of the wrist. It also innervates most of the anterior forearm muscles. The third one, the musculoskeletal nerve, arises from the lateral cord of the brachial plexus. It innervates the anterior arm muscles, which are the coracobrachialis, biceps brachii, and brachialis, and flexes the humerus and the forearm. Next, we have the radial nerve, which arises from the posterior cord of the brachial plexus, and it travels along the posterior side of the arm and then along the radial side of the forearm. The radial nerve innervates the posterior arm muscles, which are the forearm extensors, and the posterior forearm muscles and the extensors of the wrist and digits. And lastly, we have the ulnar nerve, which arises from the medial cord of the brachial plexus and descends along the medial side of the arm. It wraps posterior to the medial epicondyle of the humerus and then runs along the ulnar side of the forearm. It innervates some of the anterior forearm muscles as well as the intrinsic hand muscles. The left and right lumbar plexus are formed from the spinal nerves of L1 to L4 and along the psoas major muscles in the posterior abdominal wall. These are subdivided into an anterior division and a posterior division. The main nerve of the posterior division of the lumbar plexus is the femoral nerve. This nerve supplies the anterior thigh muscles such as the quadriceps femoris and the sartorius and ellipsois. The main nerve of the anterior division is the obturator nerve, which travels through the obturator foramen to the medial thigh. There the nerves innervate the medial thigh muscles, which adduct the thigh. The left and right sacral plexuses are formed from spinal nerves L4 to S4 and are located immediately inferior to the lumbar plexuses. The lumbar and sacral plexuses are sometimes considered to be the lumbosacral plexus. However, the nerves from the sacral plexus innervate the gluteal region, the pelvis, the posterior thigh, and almost all of the leg and foot. The sciatic nerve is the largest and longest nerve in the body. This nerve projects from the pelvis through the greater sciatic notch of the os coxae and extends into the posterior region of the thigh. The sciatic nerve is divided into two divisions, into the tibial division and the common fibular division. And this division occurs just above the popliteal muscle. From the sciatic nerve, we have the two different divisions, and so from the first division of the anterior side, we have the tibial nerve, and this is in the posterior thigh. The tibial division of the sciatic nerve innervates the hamstrings and the hamstring part of the adductor magnus. It travels in the posterior compartment of the leg, where it supplies the plantar flexors of the foot and the toe flexors. In the foot, the tibial nerve splits into the lateral and a medial plantar nerve, and there it innervates plantar muscles of the foot. Then we have the common fibular nerve, which is a second division of the sciatic nerve, and it is formed on the posterior division. And so this nerve supplies the short head of the biceps femoris muscle, and then along the lateral knee, it wraps around the neck of the fibula and then can further split.
A dermatome is a specific segment of skin that is supplied by a single spinal nerve. All spinal nerves except C1 innervate a segment of the skin. The skin of the body can be divided into sensory segments that collectively make up a dermatome map. And so this map follows a segmental pattern along the body. And so these are clinically important because they can indicate potential damage to one or more spinal nerves. One example of a flaring of a dermatome in a clinical condition is with shingles. And so this is where the chickenpox virus sometimes leaves the skin and invades the posterior root ganglion of the spinal cord. And it can remain dormant after childhood for several years, and then once an individual is an adult, then it can become reactivated, proliferate, and then travel through the sensory axons to the dermatomes. And so usually this is flares when there is some type of compromised immune system response. And so what happens is that this gives rise to rashes and blisters, and is often accompanied by intense burning or tingling.
Reflexes are rapid, automatic, involuntary reactions of muscles or glands to stimulus. All reflexes have similar properties. These include a stimulus that is required to initiate a response, a rapid response, which requires that few neurons be involved and a synaptic delay be decreased, an automatic response, which occurs the same way every time, and finally, an involuntary response, which requires no intent or pre-awareness of the reflex activity. So an example of a reflex occurs when you accidentally touch a hot burner on a stove. Instantly and automatically, you remove your hand from the stimulus, which is the hot burner, even before you are completely aware that your hand was touching something extremely hot. A reflex is a survival mechanism, and it allows us to quickly respond to a stimulus that may be detrimental to our well-being without having our brain to have to process all that information. A reflex arc is the neural wiring of a single reflex, and it always begins with a receptor in the peripheral nervous system, which then communicates with the central nervous system, and then ends at the peripheral effector such as a muscle or gland. The number of intermediate steps can vary depending on how complex the reflex is, but in general there are 5 main steps. The first is the stimulus activates the receptor, where the sensory receptors, which are the dendritic endings of a sensory neuron, respond to both external and internal stimuli such as temperature, pressure, or tactile change. Secondly, we have a nerve impulse that travels through the sensory neuron in the central nervous system. Sensory neurons conduct impulses from the receptor into the spinal cord. Third, we have information from nerve impulse that is processed in the integration center by the interneurons. The more complex reflexes may use higher numbers of interneurons within the central nervous system to integrate and process sensory information and transmit that to the motor neuron. The simplest reflexes do not involve any interneurons, and rather they just have the sensory neurons synapse directly on a motor neuron. Fourth, we have motor neurons that transmit nerve impulses to their effectors, and this is where the motor neuron transmits a nerve impulse through the anterior root of the spinal nerve to the peripheral effector organ. And then fifth, we have the effector responding to the nerve impulse from the motor neuron. And the effector is a peripheral target organ that responds to the impulse from the motor neuron. So in our example of the hand on the hot stove, What would happen is first we would have a stimulus that is received within the skin, and so the dendritic endings within the neurons of the skin would sense that change in heat. Then that information would be traveled through to the spinal cord by a sensory neuron. Within the spinal cord, we would have the interneurons that would process the information. And then the next step would be for a motor neuron to now take that information and send that to the effector, which our effector then would be our muscles to remove our hand from that hot stove. Following injury to the nervous system, there is different modalities that we can undergo repair. And so with the peripheral nervous system, we have extensive regeneration. And regeneration can occur of neurons, glia, axons, myelin, or synapses themselves. And what happens with injury is that first we have loss of myelin sheath. Once we have regeneration beginning, we have axons that actually start to sprout from where they were severed at, and they start to form these little sprouts at a proximal stump, and then they grow until they enter a distal stump, essentially where their endpoint is. There's lots of different chemotactic factors that are due to different chemicals that are produced from Schwann cells that increase axonal growth, and neurotrophic factors are also responsible for this, where they help to aid in that growth. And for an individual that has severed or injured a small nerve, we can get up to about 1 millimeter a day per growth, and then for a large nerve, we can have about 5 millimeters per day of growth. Now, the central nervous system, on the other hand, is very limited into regeneration due to inhibitory factors of glial and extracellular environment. And so due to this environment, there is a lot of non-permissible activities that can go on. And so migration of myelin-associated inhibitors, astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, and microglia counteract the repair of myelin and neurons following injury. And growth factors are not expressed as they are with the peripheral nervous system, and axons tend to lose potential for growth with normal aging, and then there's different proteins that are associated with this. And really the big cause for lack of growth is due to glial scarring that occurs within the neurons, and this is because the waste products and debris are not cleaned nearly as quickly as they are with the peripheral nervous system. This is a big area that is being highly researched, and to try and figure out why and how we can reverse this so that neurons will be able to essentially regenerate and repair themselves following injury. When we have damage to the spinal cord, there's different types of paralysis that can occur. So paralysis in general is a loss of motor function, and so usually there has to be some type of trauma that has severing of nerves that have occurred within the spinal cord, and at different areas depends on what type of paralysis an individual might have. And so a common example of paraplegia is where there is damage between T1 and L2, and so this affects the lower limbs, where the upper limbs can function, however the lower limbs cannot. And then quadriplegia would have damage within the cervical region, and this affects all four limbs, so hence the quadra. And one example of this, a famous individual, Christopher Reeves, he had incomplete severance of the C1 spinal, at the level of C1. And so due to the fact that it was incomplete, then it means that his whole spinal cord was not severed completely, and thus otherwise he would have not survived as long as he would have.